Hey everyone, welcome back to another installment of What Do You Know About, your favorite little Canadian history podcast. Today I'm taking you all on a trip to Italy and the rule of the Medici family. You may see some similarities to a few other stories that we've talked about in the past, so grab out a bingo card and see if you can spot them. I'm gonna pop in a fair dues warning as we do talk a bit about murder and infidelity throughout this episode. If you have previous knowledge of the Medici family, this is absolutely no surprise, but I want to have a warning for anyone who is not familiar with this famous Italian family so it isn't a total shock. But we aren't focusing completely on the Medici family in this episode. Instead, they are going to be the co-stars. Our heroine is Bianca Cappello, who was born in 1548 to a noble Venetian family. Her mother's family, the Morsinis, were one of the richest families in Venice at the time. They ruled over parts of Venice since their arrival to Italy in the 900s, including becoming famous statesmen, historians, and cardinals. Bianca was noted in Venetian high society as someone of great beauty, and so she was courted after at a very young age. When she was 15, she fell in love for the first time with a man named Pietro Bonaventure. Pietro was the banker to the Salvati family in Florence and used his position in a way to make Bianca think that he was also quite rich. Her parents did not consent to this union, but Bianca was under his spell, and so she eloped with him in November of 1563. Pietro immediately pocketed the jewels that were part of her very expensive dowry, and they had a daughter in 1564. Some sources say that their daughter was named Virginia, while others say she was known as Pellegrina, which was also Bianca's mother's name. Bianca was not happy in her marriage as she soon learned that Pietro's family was poor and that she was expected to pick up some of the menial work that poor families did daily. Luckily for her, her beauty was still quite noticeable, and she caught the eye of Cosimo I de' Medici, the second Duke of Florence at the time, and later the first Grand Duke of Tuscany's son and heir apparent. How would Bianca, married to a poor family of Florence, get into the purview of the ruler of the Italian city and his son? Well, her own family was attempting to get her back to Venice any way possible. Bianca lived in fear of hired men kidnapping her to take her back where she could very well be murdered as a way of restoring her family's virtue in the eyes of Venice society. When the Venetian government got involved and there was a chance that the couple would be arrested, they went to Cosimo in hopes that he'd stop the arrest from happening, as it had to go through him to happen in Florence. When Francesco showed interest in Bianca during this meeting, Cosimo happened to just forget about and ignore the request for Bianca's arrest. Francesco was married to Joanna of Austria when he first met Bianca, but that wasn't going to stop the Medici from getting their desires. Cosimo was actually one of the few Medici men who didn't have affairs while his wives were alive. He even gave his first wife some power by making her one of his most trusted political advisors, and she would step in to rule Florence in his absence. Unfortunately, she was killed alongside 2 of the 11 children during a trip to Pisa when the 3 of them contracted malaria. Francesco was the eldest child and firstborn son of the family. The family themselves had very bad luck, which wasn't surprising for the culture of Italy at the time under their rule. The eldest daughter died before she could be married to her fiancé. The second daughter was murdered by her husband because of infidelity. 2 of the younger sons died before they turned a year old, alongside one of their younger sisters, and the younger son murdered his wife, who is his cousin on his mother's side. I will be doing an episode about the last insane story from this particular line, as Eleonora is interesting in her own right, and we're still discovering parts of her life. When Francesco worked on seducing Bianca, he did what many girls only wish their men would do. He showered her in jewels, money, and other expensive presents, all while literally getting her husband right out of the way. How might he have done this? Well, by giving Pietro a job in the court and all the women he might ever want. This worked, of course, as Pietro wasn't married to Bianca for love. He wanted her beauty and the rise in society that her name could give, so he took the bait and went off to do his own thing with his new status. However, it was short-lived, as Pietro was found shot to death in the streets one morning of 1572 by a group of assassins. The stories are that it was done on Bianca's orders or done as part of some sort of shady deal that he was likely involved in. but many believe that it was on the Medici's family orders as a way to ensure that Bianca would be available for Francesco. With her husband out of the way, Bianca could officially be the Duke's mistress, as Francesco took over for his father in 1574. She was moved into a palace of her own next to his that is now known as Palazzo di Bianca Cappello. Joanna was not impressed one bit, as Bianca was flaunted in front of her consistently. In April of 1578, Joanna mysteriously fell down a set of stairs, as she was heavily pregnant with the 8th child of the family. Joanna had given birth to 6 daughters and 1 son, who died early in his life. Of the girls, only 2 lived until adulthood, with one of them, Maria, marrying Henry IV of France. After the fall, she gave birth to a 2nd son prematurely, and both died within the next 24 hours. As the circumstances of her death were considered to be mysterious, rumors flew that it was done by her husband and Bianca, but modern examination of her remains say that she died from the rupture of her uterus as her son came out presenting his arm first. My personal theory is that her fall down the stairs was not accidental, but that her medical cause of death was from the premature childbirth, which was likely triggered by the trauma of the fall. Once both Joanna and Pietro were out of the way, Bianca and Francesco married quite quickly. Bianca had given birth to a son, Antonio de' Medici, in 1576. But when Joanna had given birth to her first son, Philip, he was not acknowledged as Francesco's son until the marriage was made public on June 10, 1579. Bianca's daughter from her previous marriage was also adopted by Francesco. 2 days later, Bianca was crowned Grand Duchess of Tuscany, and her family, alongside the Venetian government, put their previous issues to the side, as Bianca rose higher up the ranks than they could do themselves. Her position, however, was still not guaranteed long term. With Antonio still being seen as illegitimate as long as Philip was alive and able to be heir, Bianca would fade away in seconds if Francesco died before her. Luckily for Bianca, Philip ended up passing away at the age of 4 in 1582, when his brain filled with spinal fluid. Francesco wasted no time in pushing for Antonio to be claimed as a legitimate son and heir to the position of Grand Duke of Tuscany. This gave Bianca a much better chance of staying relevant, as she'd be able to help Antonio rule as the regent if she and her son could outlive Francesco. Unfortunately, Bianca and Francesco would never live to see their son rule over Tuscany, as he rightfully should have. On October 19th of 1587, Francesco passed away suddenly of a mysterious illness, and Bianca followed suit the next day. It is believed that they were poisoned, as forensic teams in 2009 uncovered evidence of arsenic poisoning from their remains. In 2010, another team of scientists discovered traces of the other possible reason for their death, malaria, in Francesco's remains. I would like to think that they were probably poisoned, just knowing this family. Antonio was prepared to take over as Grand Duke from his father, but his uncle Ferdinando quickly swooped in within hours. In 1586, Bianca had a false pregnancy, so Fernando went to the cardinal with information that Antonio's pregnancy must have been false as well. The boy wasn't a Medici at all, but a stolen child from a servant that was snuck into the birthing bed. No one went against the Medici family, and so Antonio was convinced to take the habit of the Knights of Malta, which would exclude any of his future children from being able to claim much from their Medici inheritance. Antonio did go on to have 3 sons with a mistress of his and 2 illegitimate daughters. We don't know to this day if he was a true Medici or not. And so that is the story of Bianca Cappello and her fate once she got involved in the Medici family. As I said earlier, I'll be doing an episode on Eleonora de Garcia de Toledo in the near future, so there'll be more to do with the Medici family soon. I really hope that you all enjoyed this episode, and if you did, I seriously implore you to tell your friends and family about the podcast, share it on social media, and give me a glowing review on whatever podcast platform you listen on. It really does help the podcast grow, as we literally live or die on people finding us and listening. Algorithms depend on your interactions as much as they depend on us making the content. I'd also love to chat with any of you over on the Instagram page, WDYKA Podcast. I do daily posts on various events that happened that day in history from Tuesday to Friday, as well as posts on the topic of the week every Monday. Every so often, when I have some shareable primary sources, I'll also post those, so feel free to comment on anything that strikes your fancy, or even send me a DM. On that note, have an amazing week. I'll see you all next time on this crazy ride through history.